session, or the first of the afternoon sessions. I am Tuan Huang from Pepperdine University, and it is my pleasure to chair this panel. We have everything. We have a graduate student on the panel. We have a postdoc on this panel. We have a senior faculty on this panel. We even have an independent scholar on this panel. So please, I know that this is the time when we may fall asleep or something, but I would encourage you to get coffee. Slap yourself, stay awake, because we have a lot of interesting things, I think, today. And also, the second thing is this. I thought to myself, okay, I am going to use what I call a timekeeper, what I call the Michelle Thompson method. And long story short, about 11 years ago in Washington, University of Washington, Judith and Christophe, they actually organized this 3-part conference. So I was one of them, and Michelle happened to be the one who was keeping time, of my panel. And so she, instead of using something visual, she decided to use something audible. Okay, so panel, listen. Okay, 10 minutes after, when you speak for 10 minutes, I will give you a signal. All right? You know that you have 5 minutes left. All right? If you hear, okay, I'm sorry. So I will do like this. Okay. So when you hear this, you have, actually your time is over, but I'm going to give you 45 seconds to finish. All right, so 5 minutes left, 45 seconds left. Absolutely, all right, so we'll try to keep in track because I think, there's going to be a lot of good questions ahead. Okay, now audience, the same thing with you. You will have 1 minute to ask your question or comment, all right? Because if you go over 1 minute, you will hear this. All right, so we will try our best. I think we have like an hour and a half because we have 4 panelists here. So we will try our best to keep up with it, and then also, so that I think the Q&A has been terrific, and hopefully it will continue to be that way. So with no further ado, please come on up, Cindy, who will give a paper on libraries.
Okay, thank you so much, Tuan. I'm looking forward to this musical percussion of a panel. So this paper examines the decolonization and development of the National Library of South Vietnam, the Thư viện Quốc gia, from 1948 to 1958. I argue that the National Library in Saigon pursued 2 intersecting visions of the library as both national and public. Government and library administrators conceived of the National Library as a protector of national heritage through assembling and preserving Vietnamese literature, reference work, contemporary periodicals from the inherited Hanoi collections and French colonial Cochin-China Library. Furthermore, administrators envisioned the National Library as a modern public service of popular education for Saigon urbanites and students to connect with global news and literature. Through tracing the development of the National Library and the articulation of national and public, I shed light on the role of public institutions in the Republic of Vietnam. The first part traces how decolonization of the National Library was a drawn-out process, where French and Vietnamese administrators and international library organizations worked within a changing environment of urbanization, political regime changes, and the First Indochina War. The second part focuses on the logistics of creating a new national library system in service to the Republic of Vietnam, nation, and public. Given the limited time, I will focus my discussion on the second part of this paper. To build the library is to build the state. Libraries function as crucial instruments of information gathering and government documentation since the beginning years of French colonialism in Indochina in the mid-19th century. The Cochin-China Library was first founded in 1865 as a French colonial administrative library and archive. In 1917, the Cochin-China Library transformed into a public library branch of an Indochina-wide Directorate of Archives and Libraries, part of a centralized network of libraries and archives. During the French colonial period, the Cochin-China Library, pictured on the left, served as a reference library for French and Vietnamese administrators, students, and commercial workers. The Cochin China Library was housed in a cramped building at 34 La Grandière Street, together with the Central Archives of Cochin China. On June 28, 1946, the French High Commission transferred the colonial institution of the Cochin China Library to the Provisional Government of South Vietnam, placed within the Service of Education of South Vietnam, and renamed the library Thư viện Quốc gia Nam Việt. After the death of French colonial librarian Remy Bourgeois, the position of director of the Library of the South was handed over to the first Vietnamese director, Đoàn Quan Tân, on February 1948. The Geneva Accords sanctioned division of the country also marked the formal division of the General Library and the Central Archives located at Hanoi, the former capital of French colonial Indochina. So right here we're talking about the division of the Hanoi collection on the right. So between 1954 and 1955, a quarter of the Hanoi General Library materials, as well as materials from the University of Hanoi and the Central Archives, and 16 library and archives personnel from Hanoi were transferred to South Vietnam. The transferred materials were housed temporarily in the Petroski High School. The collection of transferred material included over 17,000 books, half of the serials from the colonial period, the archives of the Gin Luc Viceroy located in North Vietnam, and 35,000 legal deposit items collected in Hanoi. These transferred materials totaled over 700 boxes. Most of the transferred collections were claimed to be the Indochina legal deposit, and duplicate copies collected up to June 1954. This collection of materials from Hanoi merged with the existing National Library of the South, the former Cochin China Library, and the combined libraries were renamed the National Library of Vietnam, the Thư viện Quốc gia Việt Nam. So here I'm showing here the division of a third of the collections from Hanoi on the bottom, and the transferred collection which created then the National Library System on the right. Since 1949, administrators discussed creating a hybrid National Library and Museum building in the heart of Saigon. In 1955, President Ngo Dinh Diem designated the building of a new National Library building on the site of the former colonial prison in Saigon. The new National Library project developed into an even more ambitious proposal for a cultural center, a Trung tâm Văn hóa, which would include the new National Administration Institute, the Humanities and Law School, a national library with a reading room with 150 seats and storage large enough for at least 300,000 volumes. On April 3, 1956, President Ngo Dinh Diem inaugurated the building of the National Library and Cultural Center project with this bricklaying ceremony pictured here. At this cornerstone laying ceremony, the State Secretary of Cultural Affairs delivered a speech recognizing the legacy of the colonial prison and the significance of the library for national culture. The State Secretary continued to describe the dream of the new National Library as a meeting center for Eastern and Western cultures, as well as a source of information and communication for all of mankind. Other library administrators described the aspiration for the National Library to offer the same level of services as other large libraries of civilized and economically developed countries. However, due to economic difficulties and political uncertainty, these building plans fragmented into separate building projects and was stalled until 1968, which is when official construction began. The new building of the National Library at 69 Gia Long Street was not completed and opened until December 23, 1971. So to clarify, this proposed new building, you might be more familiar with this building here, which is today the General Science Library building. However, my discussion will focus more on the meaning of nation and public prior to the establishment of this building. So today we've discussed a lot about discourses of republicanism, and in this talk I really focus on the meanings and discussion and debate regarding the meaning of the public within republicanism. So the National Library was an amalgamation of both old and new, colonial and post-colonial. The National Library inherited colonial legacies of library organization, but also sought to define its own identity as both national institution and a public library. A 1956-57 library report described the National Library as a library of information and general culture, with a collection of selectively chosen, organized books intended for the public. The library has a three-part goal, like all public libraries: to inform, to educate, and to entertain. The report made a temporal distinction between private or administrative libraries in the past and the national public library of the future. According to the report, the concept of a public library had not existed in Vietnam's past. Often the discussion on the meaning of a public library focused on the core responsibilities of a library to serve its reading public. In order to accomplish its mission, the report focused on understanding the primary readers and types of preferred reading matter. The library clientele, as shown here, has shifted from administrators to primarily university students. The library administrator in this report argued that acquisitions of new books and periodicals also must align with the needs of its readers, as well as the three-part mission of the library to inform, educate, and entertain. The author elaborated on the importance of selective acquisitions based on reader behavior, as shown here, and the purposeful acquisition of reading matter, such as general works, textbooks, popular literature, suggests how library administrators frame the library as a public resource for supplementary education for the larger community of literate Vietnamese. So in 1954, the National Library Reading Room held nearly 80,000 books, of which 88% was in French, 6% in Vietnamese, and 5% in Chinese. In the 1950s, the National Library at Gia Long sought to build its collection by actively requesting books in serials on contemporary politics, sciences, libraries, and economics from France, updated books from America, and other contemporary international works. Furthermore, many libraries and institutions from all over the world, such as UNESCO, the French National Bibliography, and the Michigan State University Advisory Group, donated many works to the National Library in Saigon. In particular, the library sought to expand its Vietnamese collection, as well as acquire more Vietnamese translations of Chinese, French, and English works. In order to access books in the library, readers consulted the reading room catalog and could submit a request for 2 books at a time. A library manager then proceeded to pull the books from storage. Other books for consultation in the reading room were reference books, dictionaries, encyclopedia, directories, manuals, and over 50 journals in French, Vietnamese, and English, which could be consulted freely without a request. In 1957, the Gia Long Reading Room still only had a limited number of highly prized reading seats. Saigon readers, administrators, teachers, university students, and high school students rushed through the doors of the Gia Long Library, pushing each other out of the way in a scramble for the 48 seats available in the Central Reading Room. In a letter to the Department District Police of District 1 on June 13, 1957, Director Phan Vo Qui requested security backup to maintain order in the library. The reading room at Gia Long could not handle the earnest university student readers on summer holiday, who aggressively pushed readers out of the way to claim the limited seating in the reading room at opening hours, as shown here. According to Phan Vo Qui in 1957, the library had become a space of study for university students who crowded in the library reading room to study and socialize during the summer months. In a letter to the Ministry of National Education, Phan Vo Qui proposed a series of changes to take place after the annual closure, July 15 to August 15. He proposed to create a quota system of daily reading cards to monitor and limit the access to the library according to number of seats available. Each week, there would only be a total of 480 access cards, color-coded by day and session, morning or afternoon session. Furthermore, each day, 8 of these seats would be reserved for infrequent but important readers, such as professors and administrators. He developed this system in hopes of restoring order in the reading room. New library regulations were also to be implemented to monitor and control reader access and behavior. On entering the library, readers must provide their reader cards so that libraries could collect reader usage statistics. On exiting the reading room, all reader belongings and bags must be inspected to prevent stolen materials. Furthermore, the regulations included a clause that emphasized that readers should treat the book with care for the benefit of the collective. For the first time, the library included a clause that also permitted the library to refuse the entrance of any reader who dressed inappropriately or behaved impolitely. By 1958, the Zalong Library reported a daily average of 200 compared to 100 in the colonial period. Note, this is the same size reading room as the one that was shown in the first introductory slide. The separation of serious, infrequent researcher and student readers sheds light on this underlying hierarchy of ideal library readers. Library administrators of the Saigon National Library at 34 Zalong complained about the lack of decorum and serious reading. These hierarchies of leisure and serious readers reflected the continual debate over the mission of the library. Was the functional role of the National Library a public educational resource for all, regardless of if they were students, researchers, or administrators? Should the space be used for study by Vietnamese students or as a research resource for administrators and professors? Concerns over the existing library collections also pushed the question of the library mission to the surface. With the majority of the collections in French, the library was not meeting the literacy needs for the larger Vietnamese language reading public. Since the library was officially under the Ministry of National Education, was the role of the library to provide national education and mass literacy to the Vietnamese people? This paper reveals how the structure, politics, and role of the National Library was shaped by colonial legacies, fragmented collections, and changing urban reading publics. The organization of the National Library in Saigon was in a state of flux between 48 and 58, divided between 3 locations throughout the city: the inherited Cochin China Library at 34 Zalong, the transferred Hanoi materials at Petroski School, and the lending section that was available at 194 D Pasteur. I show how the inheritances of the colonial institutions intersected with decolonization and nation-building efforts. Library administrators justified the importance of the National Library using Republican values of state responsibility to provide public services and educational resources to its citizens. Yet the ambitious visions of the National Library, as both national and public, confronted the everyday realities of limited personnel, space, and funding to fulfill the needs of the Saigon Shalom readers. Thank you.
Perfect timing. That was perfect timing. All right, we move right on along to our next speaker. Eugene from Northwestern University.
Hello, I am Eugene and I will be presenting this talk entitled "When State Propaganda Becomes Social Knowledge: Legacies of the Southern Republic." I would like to begin by playing this short montage of a recent Vietnamese American film. And at the same time, I want to read an excerpt. Excerpt from a propaganda document drafted in 1956. And on this last attempt, which was the 6th, they were finally fortunate enough to escape the fangs of the big dog, to arrive on the shore of freedom. Drawing from the experiences from previous failed attempts, this time they prepared fishing nets, faked the fishing expedition, but had to proceed in the dead of night. At communist police stations on the way, they had to keep women and children underneath the deck of the boat and had to cover the mouths of children to prevent them from coughing or crying as to avoid the suspecting eyes of the communist police. For some 7 to 8 days, although they had to paddle against the waves and the winds of the vast ocean, their dose endured starvation and thirst to save rice and water for the children. Because in fear of the communist police, they dared not to bring with them much provisions. floating on the vast ocean, placing their fate upon the winds and the waves of the endless ocean. All they had was a belief, a firm belief in protection of the omnipotent, and a hope. Hope yearning for a life of freedom and warmth under the safeguard of the Republican government led by President Ngo. And it was because of this belief and the love for freedom that they, the 17 warriors, reached the land of freedom. This excerpt that I just read was developed during the Communist Denunciation campaign to describe the political significance of the mass migration of northern refugees following the signing of the 1954 Geneva Accords. Although written in 1956, the passage demonstrates stark commonalities to this 2007 film displayed on the screen. Directed by Ham Jong, the film depicts the experiences of the Vietnamese refugees following the fall of Saigon, from hiding below a deck to fleeing the dead at night. To the broader themes of fear and desperation, the passage that I just read appeared to articulate a scene-by-scene narration of the passengers' experiences on the rickety fishing boat of Dai. The themes of freedom, flight, communist repression, and noble sacrifice are evident in both production, although they are temporally removed by more than half a century. The core driving question that I am addressing is precisely the similarity. Although the migration following the signing of the Geneva Accords and that following the fall of Saigon share certain historical commonalities, the analogous ways in how these two events were depicted cannot be reduced to something innate to these events themselves. In the 2007 Vietnamese America and 1956 South Vietnam were worlds apart. As I argue, the similarities between these two temporal markers is less an obvious consequence of their being refugees in flight of communism than it is the survival and perpetuation of a political narrative that dates back to the formation of the First Republic and continue to influence Vietnamese America today. This perpetuation is a political achievement of nation-building efforts on the part of the South Vietnamese state. This perpetuation makes Vietnamese America a political legacy of the ideological work designed to form not only an anti-communist Vietnamese nation, but an anti-communist citizenry whose political loyalty will remain to that of the Republic, its flag, and its ideals. Centering on this question of historical continuity, my project intervenes in contemporary scholarship in two major ways. First, it addresses the scholarship on Vietnamese Americans, which has largely emphasized memories of war and trauma of the refugee journey to think about the origins of Vietnamese American anti-communism, rather than looking into the anti-communist politics as it has existed during the Republic of Vietnam. Second, my paper provides a grounded political history of the Vietnamese Republic within a Vietnam War scholarship that has primarily focused on American intervention or the Vietnamese communists. This approach has largely ignored the agency of voices of non-communist Vietnamese actors. By laying out the history of ideological work under the Republican period, I hope to demonstrate the historical tissues that connect Vietnamese America and Republican Vietnam. I also hope to counteract a definition of anti-communism that is solely premised on notions of experienced traumas, experienced trauma, communist atrocities, or memories of war. I hope to convince you to view President Vietnamese American anti-communism as a historical construction, a result of processes that predate the 1975 migration. Doing so, I hope to sketch out and encourage new directions in Vietnamese and Vietnamese American studies. I hope to initiate a conversation about contemporary legacies and relevance of a political entity that ceased to formally exist some 4 decades ago. With such a conversation, I believe the scholarship can begin to shed light on the ways in which elements that belong to the lost era can somehow survive, provide insight and context to issues, politics, and norms that exist in the present-day community. To empirically map out the ideological work during the Republican era, I rely on an unstudied political education initiative called the Political Study Program, Eugene or PSP, deriving from the activities of the personalist philosophy of the Gong Lao Party. Political study was designed to cultivate loyalty for the regime in power by ensuring that those attending study sessions would absorb the ideas propagated by the Republican state. For the design of the program, it was not enough for students to simply know the materials presented. Participants were to integrate the lessons taught into the everyday conduct, how they view the world, and their role in the development of the Vietnamese nation. Developed during the Republican era, the PSP standardized both engagement and content of ideological discourse. Structurally, political studies activities Political study activities were directed from the top down and was led by a central body that assigned study materials and monitored study activities. As a key program of ideological dissemination, the PSP provides a valuable avenue to explore the ideological work under the Republican state. First, the PSP was one of the few state projects that was enacted at the start of the First Republic and actually survived to the end of the Second. Apart from a 20-month hiatus following the collapse of the First Republic, the PSP was a regular and continuous state effort, and thus provides a documented chronology of the Republican era. This allows me to empirically trace the actual activities of state ideological work. Second, the practice of political study was a routinized aspect of administrative life. Each organizational unit study was expected to devote approximately 2 hours weekly to this task. Third, because the PSP activities were also enacted outside of the state, particularly as essential components of broader mobilizing projects, the content of these sessions can serve as a proxy to examine the broader ideological discourse. And last, because the PSP was most effectively implemented within the South Vietnamese administration and military, the study of the PSP provides a lens into internal and quotidian activities of the Republican state. Moreover, because these former administrative and military personnel would eventually become community leaders within the Vietnamese diaspora, the program's emphasis on state agents provides an empirical linkage that connects the ideological work of the Republic to the political dynamics within Vietnamese American communities today. Historically, although major administrative changes often brought with them different ideological emphases, values of nationalism and anti-communism were readily apparent in study materials, regardless of what administration was in power. On the slide is a graphical summary of the major structural and ideological transformations that occurred during the duration of the PSP. Given time constraints, I cannot extensively detail the institutional history of the PSP. Summarily, however, there are many iterations of the program. Despite these changes, the fundamentals of political education remain core to the program. Key study materials were disseminated to support major state projects during moments of political change and turmoil, and for important national holidays. Transcripts and speeches by the president or high-ranking officials were also regularly utilized. Due to the state's demand for its consistent and regular study sessions, political study was a deeply embedded aspect of administrative life. This was an achievement, a continuous effort by various regimes to ensure that sessions were well-attended and, quote, enthusiastic. Different mechanisms were implemented, including professional training of cadres for presentation, standardization of study materials, a system of rewards and punishment to ensure active commitment, and attendance keeping. These efforts by the state allowed political study to be routinized as a practice that allowed the PSP to survive as long as it did. This durability of practice allowed ideas taught through the program to endure as well. What this means is that narratives, examples, framework, and terminologies taught during the First Republic were redeployed by later regimes. To demonstrate the discursive continuity, I used the example of the South Vietnamese narrative on the Geneva Accords. Themes, rationales, and lessons related to the 1954 Geneva signings developed during the First Republic would make their way into the study documents of the Second. This reutilization allowed the lessons taught in one period to reapply to developments temporally removed from the events that originally inspired them. Because of the routinization of political study, state narratives that were once novel were transformed to taking for granted truths that were habitually reutilized to frame new events and historical developments. The narrative on the Geneva Accords can be seen as the origin story of the Vietnamese Republic. For one, it establishes the beginning point of communist atrocities against the people of the South. For another, it lays out the justification for why the Republic of Vietnam should be supported and why adamant anti-communism was necessary and obvious. Among the original topics studied with the inauguration of the PSP, the Geneva narrative lays the groundwork of the South Vietnamese condemnation of communist atrocities. First, as a narrative that legitimized Ngo Dinh Diem in his political contest against Bao Dai, they regurgitated Diem's position that South Vietnam, quote, did not sign the Accords, they cannot be bound in any way by these agreements. Second, reject the proposal for reunification laid out in the Accords because, according to Diem, in the independence and reunification of the country, must be in freedom rather than slavery. Third, the narrative paints the colonists as traitors who doled out South Vietnam to international communism. and who manipulated the national aspiration of the Vietnamese people. Fourth, it blames the division of the country and horrors of war on the communists. It depicts communists as the collaborators to French colonialism. And last, it criticizes communist-supported measures to establish peace or neutrality in the Cold War. On this last point, critique of the concept of normal relations stand as an illustrative example. Presented as a communist scheme, study materials argue that communist efforts to establish normal relations sounded very gentle and humanistic. The communists, in fact, were beating the drums while stealing, meaning that communists called for peace while preparing for war. While much of the study materials developed during the communist denunciation campaign revolve around articulating and providing evidence of communist atrocities, following the reorganization of the PSP in 1958, study materials increasingly became tailored to diplomatic concerns and South Vietnamese standing in the free world. These new focuses emphasize Vietnamese underdevelopment, democratic progress, and personalism as a solution to Vietnam's post-colonial economic and political woes. These developments affected the articulation of the Geneva narrative, which began to incorporate a contrast between the free South and repressive North. It was expanded to depict the communists as not only deceivers and traitors, but also those who were military aggressors and violators of the signed 1954 treaty. The common refrain was that the communist North signed the treaty, but ended up violating it. The South, on the other hand, did not sign this treaty, but desired peace and thus worked to enact its provisions. These revised themes on the Geneva Accords would continue until the final days of the First Republic. However, despite the death of Ngo Dinh Diem in 1963, the narratives established under his rule did not die with him. Rather, they were repurposed by subsequent regimes. This was evident in the Day of National Resentment, an annual political commemoration on the 20th of July, informally inaugurated under the administration of Eugene. In 1964, South Vietnam commemorated 10 years of communist atrocities. The week leading up to the commemorative holiday involved state-funded public events stoking resentment against the Geneva Accords. One of the few instances in which political study sessions were utilized during the PSP's 20-month hiatus, study documents painted the South as a peace-loving people and the North as a military aggressor. More novel to the time, study documents also deployed the concept of Bac Diem, or the Northward March, to rile up the anti-communist sentiments and support for the military administration. Under the Second Republic, the Geneva Accords took on novel dimensions as the narrative was supplied to frame the negotiations that were underway in Paris. A process of wrought controversy, the two administrations sought to carefully toe the line between the war-mobilizing efforts while also justifying the regime's participation in ongoing peace talks. Faced with these contradictions, the Republican state regurgitated the existence that South Vietnam was a peace-loving country, but was disastrously wrecked by the war. A war caused by the Vietnamese colonists in collaboration with the French colonialists. Through study materials, the Thieu administration laid out its fundamental demand that colonists retreat all their troops for peace to be actualized. However, peace, although desired, was slim because firstly, the countless atrocities committed by the colonists, and secondly, the deceptive nature of Vietnamese communists evidenced by the violation of the Geneva Accords. As Washington and Hanoi neared a deal towards the end of 1972, political study materials began emphasizing communist duplicity and the inevitability of communist violation to any signed treaties. Indeed, even prior to the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, the treaty was already being framed in accordance to the dominant Geneva narrative that had informed Republican policies for almost 2 decades. After the Paris Agreement was signed in January 1973, study documents sought to depict the Republic as the winner in the peace deal, but quickly returned to themes of communist duplicity and aggression in violating the ceasefire. To say that the Geneva narrative ended with the fall of Saigon is to ignore how contemporary Vietnamese refugee communities talk about their journey after 1975 and how the Geneva Accords and the Paris Agreement haunt Vietnamese American political conversation today. While an extended historical exploration of the anti-communism as it exists in Vietnamese America goes beyond the confines of this talk, we can point to instances in which the Republican narrative on the Geneva Accord influences Vietnamese American political discourse after 1975. A key example is a 1982 propaganda publication by the National United Front for the Liberation of Vietnam, or colloquially, Lạc Cộng Hòa Của Mình, This organization dominated Vietnamese American politics during the 1980s, and the pamphlet displayed on the screen, entitled Dung Tung Mung Song, utilizes photographs of death and destruction caused during the war and after to conjure an image of perpetual communist brutality. Themes of communist atrocities and suffering following the Geneva Accords are evident throughout its pages. The document connects the migration following the Geneva signings to the refugee flight following 1975. Second, you will soon see a more recent example, which are displayed on the screen. In contemporary Vietnamese American politics, communist atrocities, both personal and national, are regularly mobilized to provide moral and ideological justification for anti-communist activism and protest. The key message that I want to leave with you today is this discursive and political connectivity between the Republic of Vietnam and Vietnamese America. The anti-communist politics that is currently prominent in Vietnamese American communities is derived from the anti-communist politics of the Republic of Vietnam. However, this prominence is neither given nor automatic. Indeed, as my exploration of the PSP demonstrate, specific narratives were systematically and carefully disseminated by the Republican state. These narratives were utilized by different historical contexts and by different regimes, and this reutilization continued after the fall of Saigon. The anti-communism we see in Vietnamese America today is no accident in history. It was a product of purposeful or meaningful activities, like that or what was practiced in the political study sessions, allowing certain ideas originating from the state to become ingrained and hegemonic. This continuity provides a new avenue for scholarship on the Vietnam War. As scholars, we can begin to talk about the contemporary legacies and the relevance of a political entity that has ceased to exist some 4 decades ago and is spatially removed half a world away. Our discussion can begin to shed light on the ways in which elements that belong to a lost past can somehow survive. The legacies of the Southern Republic are yet to be explored. As scholars on the era, perhaps it is time for them to do so.
To the next. So now, next will be Jason talking about Northern Catholics migration to the South.
So everyone, you'll have to forgive me. I'm suffering from both jet lag and also a nasty stomach ache. So forgive me. I'm a little out of it. I wonder, is it okay if I walk over? Can people hear me? Do I need the? I don't even know if I need the mic with my voice. Thank you. I tend to, I would prefer to move around. So, just the title slide. It's okay. All right. So, give me just a second. So. The title of my paper was, is, They Eat the Flesh of Children, Migration, Resettlement, and Sectionalism in South Vietnam, 1954 to 1957. And I think one of the themes that has been present in all of the talks today is the Great Migration of 1954 and 1955. Bao Phien, the great writer of South Vietnam, at one point many years ago, I think in the 1980s, he pointed out that the American period, 1954 to 1975, was really bookended by 2 migrations. One was the 54, 55, and then the post-1975. But the sad fact of the matter relating to the Great Migration, what was officially known as the Great Migration, which I'll get into a second. The sad fact of the matter is that the Great Migration has really been lost in terms of the history of the Vietnam War. It's usually just a footnote to the history. And when we consider the size and scope of the Great Migration that came about in light of the Geneva Accords of 1954, we need to take a step back as historians and people in other fields to reconsider this migration. When you consider that the migration was over 860,000 people fleeing from north to south, my interest in this is what was the impact of this migration on South Vietnamese society, or Republic of Vietnam society. And in my dissertation, and currently the work I'm doing, is quite simply, it affected everything. From politics, to the economy, from culture, to people's relationships. In particular, Southern and Northern relationships. When you consider that 860,000 people represented close to 8% of the entire population in South Vietnam, this is a remarkable story. There was a very remarkable journalist named Gertrude Samuels. She wrote about migrations and diaspora in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And in National Geographic of June 1955, she had a great comparison. She asked Americans reading National Geographic to consider if 25 million Americans were to pick up and move from the United States to the South. That is the predicament that was facing the South Vietnamese regime, or at this point, the temporary authority after 1954. The Ngo Dinh Diem regime. But we need to consider, as she points out, that this is not the United States. This is not a society that is stable. This is not a political situation that is stable. This is a country that has just come out of colonialism and just come out of war, the First Indochina War. So with that in mind, this is where I start from, okay? And the story that I wanted to tell, that came about in my dissertation, was one, again, how did it impact Southern society? And what I discovered was quite remarkable. I start this idea, this question, they eat the flesh of children, okay? One of the things that I noticed in reading the press in 1954 and 55 in the South was that there were already tensions felt. Okay? Even before resettlement happened, there was already tensions between Southerners and Northerners. The title, "They Eat the Flesh of Children," comes from a rumor that was spreading in Saigon and its surroundings in 1955, March of 1955. In fact, in March of 1955, schools and markets closed down for several days because Southerners had become so fearful of Northerners. There was a rumor spreading that Northerners were capturing children, Southern children, and harvesting their flesh to make things like pho, nem, and I think pressed meat. Okay, there is no evidence for this. Okay, there is no evidence for this. Indeed, John Van Hung, who at the time was the mayor of Saigon, he came out and forcefully said, "There's absolutely no evidence for this, and indeed, this is communist propaganda." Okay. But the question remains, why in 1955 did so many Southerners believe this, that they were keeping their children at home? Okay. Which leads me to the next problem. If we embrace the conventional scholarship about the Great Migration and Resettlement, which is that Northerners were the beneficiaries of great privilege, then how is it that Southerners would believe that Northerners were harvesting meat? Okay, how would they believe that Northerners were harvesting meat, harvesting flesh to make these dishes? It doesn't make sense. And so as I started thinking about this problem and going through the archives and newspapers, I discovered that there's a lot more to the story than just that. First of all, we need to consider the prehistory, before 1954. Okay, before 1954, what you find is there is already existing tensions between Northerners and Southerners. A great deal of distrust. Northerners who were being brought down in the 1920s and 30s to serve on, to serve in plantations, to serve on rubber plantations, were, many of the men were described as lechers, men who had come and tried to steal the Southern women. They were also described as filthy, and these kinds of stereotypes became part of, and I could go into a long list dating further back, but these kinds of stereotypes came to kind of infused, embedded in our notions, or in Southern notions of the Northerners. So when you had 860,000 Northerners arriving, this created quite frankly a mess. But add to this, as I said, the conditions facing Southerners. Okay? They themselves were just coming out of war. Many of them had faced, excuse me, can I get some water, please? Is there any water? Sorry, my mouth. Many of them had faced the struggles of war, being forced to flee from their own homes, and then to watch the resettlements. What I discovered is, as they watched the resettlements of the Northerners throughout the South, okay, obviously they felt a certain amount of jealousy towards this. Now, this is not to say what the Northern resettlement was in any way, shape, or form. Thank you very much. Lemonade, thank you. And this is not to say that the Northern experience of resettlement was in some way privileged. All the evidence that I found suggests that Northern experiences with resettlement was nothing short of struggle. They faced hunger themselves. They faced, there were almost 319 resettlement villages, thank you, in the South. And the Northerners, in most cases, could barely survive. But the unfortunate situation was that they were asked to create homes in places where very few people lived. In many cases, sent to upland areas like the Central Highlands, or to places like the Mekong Delta. At least they were claimed to be very few people living there. In fact, often what happened was that the ZM regime, sorry, forgive me, excuse me a second, guys. But yeah, I'm going to sit for a second. Thank you so much. I apologize, everyone. So the ZM regime faced the ZM regime faced a real conundrum. How do you deal with both Northern migrants who need to be resettled and Southerners who themselves felt they were deserving of assistance in light of the end of the First Indochina War? And there was really no good answer. And in 1955, there was on the anniversary of the signing of the Geneva Accords, which was not celebrated in the South as we might imagine. Instead, it was recognized as a day of shame. And around this first anniversary, the Diem regime announced something known as Muxing, or self-sufficiency, self-reliance, which we can connect to personalism, which Nguyen Lap Duy had talked quite a bit about earlier. This idea that the Vietnamese people, whether northern or southern, should become self-sufficient on their own in their communities. The idea behind this was that Southerners and Northerners were going to coexist with each other, and they were going to help one another. This leads to these ideas that we've heard earlier today about communitarianism, and this idea of creating community between Southerners and Northerners. The problem with this was that in many cases, in most cases, Northerners were living on their own in these segregated communities with Southerners on the outside. And what this manifested, as I discovered in my own research, what this manifested was a great deal of tension between Northerners and Southerners. Rather than being able to create a broader community, Northern and Southern, what you instead find is these very discrete corporate Northern villages with the Southern villages or Southern communities on the outside, and very little integration between them. In fact, when I was in Kaisan in the Mekong Delta a few years ago, I still found that many people living in Kaisan, in these communities along canals, they themselves were still speaking with the Northern accent. The locals there would call them, the Southern locals would call them, Southern inhabitants would call them đậu giá, sprouts. Or rather, the Southerners would call them rau muống, and the Northerners would call them đậu giá, or sprouts, bean sprouts, because of the kinds of food that they would eat. And it was remarkable because this is going on 60 years later, and these kinds of tensions still exist. I found that many Northerners and Southerners don't share in farming technology to this day, and communities up in the Central Highlands continue to suffer between the northern communities that popped up there in 1956 and 57, and some of the ethnic minority groups in the upland areas. They too do not have much engagement with each other, except in very official capacities. Very little intermarriage. So in many ways, the legacies of the Vietnam War, but more importantly, of this great migration, are still present today. And it's one of the tragedies that this migration has not been given more ink to. It's one of the, to my mind, for scholars who are working on this period, it is one of the real issues, one of the fundamental issues that we really need to start delving into and considering its effect on both society of the RVN period, but also post-1975 as well. So thank you very much. I apologize.
All right, and that brings us to our last presenter of this panel, Christophe from University of Washington.
So I guess I'm the senior scholar, also known as the old white guy. Thank you very much for organizing this, and also for everybody else who's involved in organizing this. This feels like, I feel like a kid in the candy store. When this call for papers came out, I was very inspired by the agenda. Okay, so when this still not. Doesn't happen that often that people can't hear my voice. Is it better now? Okay. So I was very inspired when the call for papers came out. The agenda really spoke to me. Republicanism and the Republic. I will speak not on republicanism, but on the Republic. Research and conceptual papers were invited. I'm not presenting a research paper, but a conceptual paper. And there was this kind of a scholarly and what I would think ethical commitment also to moving beyond easy binaries, giving Vietnamese agency more prominence, and also to allow space for marginalized voices to be heard. These are things that I have been embracing for quite a long time. My paper is titled Terminology Matters, the Fiction of South Vietnam. And I want to say that I understand that this is a very difficult and sensitive subject matter. South Vietnam is deeply intertwined with personal identities, communal identities, with passionate idealism, and also with a lot of pain and suffering. And I want to acknowledge that. I come to the subject matter from the perspective of an educator committed to fairly and justly representing all Vietnamese factions throughout the tragic years of war. So I'm not interested in refighting the war or litigating it, but to for my students and other audience to find a narrative that will encapsulate the various Vietnamese perspectives and factions. By doing so, I'm focusing in particular on spatial representations of political and military events. And that has to do with mapping, it has to do with the particular terminology that we're using, and it has to do with the rhetorical framing, particularly in Western discourses about the war. And that's where the issue at hand comes in. And that is, for me, the habitual equation of the term South Vietnam, that is the territory south of the DMZ, with the Republic alone, and the collapsing of a normative political space, South Vietnam, with but one of the contending Vietnamese states. And this is a very prevalent in popular culture, including map representations, the documentaries about the war that are now have been around for several decades, and also quite widespread in academic writing, especially in American academia. And here are some of the issues that arise. One is that this normatively defined term, South Vietnam, misrepresents the Republic as both too small but also too big. So it's too small because of the all Vietnamese claims of the Republic and its ambitions to eventually unite Vietnam under its authority, not realized, but also too big because particularly after 1959 and until the end of the war, the Republic could not control the entire area that is denoted by South Vietnam, and at times only controlled territory far below 50% of that space. The second point is it runs counter, South Vietnam as a normative political space runs counter to the historical facts in the ways in which Vietnamese states of all ideological shades were established, their territorial and sovereignty claims. It runs counter to some of the issues surrounding the Geneva Accords that explicitly reaffirmed the indivisibility of Vietnam and the temporary and conditionality of the Accords. And third, it prevents, rather than furthers, in my opinion, a more complex understanding of the various Vietnamese actors. And so in that regard, I see oftentimes the term South Vietnam as a normative political space assigned to the Republic, quite undermining our efforts to move beyond binary narratives, giving agenda, and having marginalized voices heard. So the paper, just to move very quickly through that, takes various steps. The first one is to look at the establishment of the various Vietnamese states from the Empire of Vietnam in early 1945 to the Democratic Republic in September 1945, the Associated State of Vietnam in the summer and fall of 1949, and then the Republic of Vietnam in October 1955. All of these states were designed as all Vietnamese in their claims. They affirmed the indivisibility of Vietnamese territory. They established themselves as, or claimed to be, the sole legitimate political authority, and therefore they were exclusivist and hostile to one another. So for most of the time, particularly after 1949, of course, you have the overlapping rival and exclusivist claims of opposing Vietnamese states. In a second step, I look at the Geneva Accords. Here to make a few points that, again, the Geneva Accords explicitly confirmed that it was one country. The DMZ was not seen as a political border. It was a temporary partition. Even that was, of course, too much for Bao Dai, who at that point decided not to support the Geneva Accords. So again, indivisibility of territories looms very large. And then, of course, also the conditionality of the accords premised on the elections to be held in 1956. And that was, of course, a roadmap to a peaceful solution of the violent conflict that broke down when the elections would not be held. The third point I'm making, and that is simply, I posit this as a thesis, is that at heart, the normative space of South Vietnam was a US frame to capture and support the US project of a stable and sustainable anti-communist space south of the DMZ. So the United States itself is not committed to the reunification of Vietnam, unlike those Vietnamese states. The fourth step I'm taking is to look at the territorial extent of Republican and Democratic Republican claims and their reality. And here I did want to point to the all Vietnamese ambitions of the Republic. It was particularly in the interregnum period in the Second Republic, publicly committed to all Vietnamese ambitions, as you can see here, and also, I hope this works, this is a very small depiction of a stamp, again, of Bac Dien, of the advance to the north, probably from 1972, so before the Paris Agreement. But on the other hand, that the Republic, despite its all Vietnamese ambitions, continuously lost territorial control, particularly compared between the First and the Second Republic. Here I'm using recently declassified CIA maps of the situation. So this is not the right one. So this is Southern Territory south of the DMZ, 1963, with yellow here denoting Republican authority. Pink and red would be then NLF dominated or controlled areas. If we move 2 years later to 1965, again, these are CIA maps recently declassified. You see that, in fact, now blue is Republican control, quite diminished red areas of communist projection of power is quite enhanced. And then 2 years later, after the massive influx of American forces, you see a deeply fragmented space, but here especially, so that it affects obviously also communist control over contiguous territory, but the Republican controlled areas are now deeply fragmented and reduced to islands. So what we sometimes refer to as the leopard spot or leopard skin map that was a reality throughout the war until its bitter end. So I turn to examples in popular depiction. So that is the second part of my paper, in which I lay this problem out in how it plays out in popular depictions. Here in particular, the documentaries, recent and older ones as well. And so several themes stand out when people in these documentaries embrace the normative space of a South Vietnam that is assigned only to the Republic, and that is the mythology that these were two separate countries with a political border. Northerners had no business in the South, Southerners had no business in the North. It was seemingly authorized by an international agreement, a misreading of the Geneva Accords, so that sets up that binary of South Vietnam and North Vietnam that I'm trying to overcome in my own pedagogy. The second one is the creation of flat space. When you have a flat terminology, here is South Vietnam, it's normatively assigned, that then finds reflection in flat mapping as normative spaces. Let me click out here. Here's an example from 1950, so the Burns documentary depicting the situation in 1950. It completely ignores the existence of the Democratic Republic and of the associated state of Vietnam. So these Vietnamese states, Vietnamese agency is completely denied. Vietnam in 1950 is still a colonial space with a big French flag. So Western supremacist notions of how this space should work are prevailing. Whereas when we move on into the 1960s, then we are seeing, again, flat mapping, very different from the CIA maps of actual force distribution. Here we see, this is Ken Burns talking about fighting in Binh Dinh province, all of South Vietnam, the big flag of the Republic. This is flat space, not the complex space in which the fighting and the acrimony took place. And finally, I want to show you also how this works with the end of the war. So this is from the 1983 PBS documentary, just before the final communist offensive that started, in fact, in the southern central highlands, so Ban Me Thuot and Pleiku. But the map here gives us the illusion that these are two separate spaces, that the Republic is in full control up to the DMZ, which we know it's not true, and that then when the final offensive happens, it happens as a northern invasion spilling over the DMZ going south, in actually counterfactual to the actual fighting that took place from Phuoc Long province to the Mekong Delta to the southern central highlands. So the last point I want to make is that South Vietnam, as a normatively assigned political space, is also preventing the inclusion of other voices that had similar claims to that space and that identity. some examples are the wholly made-up term of the North Vietnamese Army that didn't exist. It was the People's Army of Vietnam that felt it had every right to be in the entirety of its country. It was that did not feel that when it crossed the DMZ that it was invading a separate country. It also excludes other Southerners from that category of South Vietnam. Here in the documentaries, oftentimes you can see this in the labeling, the mislabeling of other Southerners as either a North Vietnamese Army or Viet Cong. So they're not South Vietnamese, they're Viet Cong. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to show you these images. In consequence, what you have is that South Vietnam, as this normatively assigned political space, is also therefore de-Southernizing other Southerners that were not loyal to the Republic and who are equally silenced and marginalized in many Western discourses. So to conclude with an ethical or scholarly commitment to complexity as opposed to simple binaries, to giving Vietnamese agency as opposed to US centric narratives and Western supremacist notions of colonialism, and also to allow space for marginal voices to be heard. That is an indivisible commitment and should apply to all factions equally. And my point here is that the trope of South Vietnam, quote unquote, ultimately stands in the way of that goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Christophe. Thank you so much. All right, I think we have approximately, we probably want to leave a few minutes in between this panel and the next one, but I think we have about 10 minutes or so, you know, or maybe 11 minutes. So please, questions. I see a lot of hands, so I don't know how this will. Okay, all right. Go for it.
All right, this question's for E. So I work a lot within the Little Saigon community in Orange County, and you can clearly see in those areas, you know, the South Vietnamese anti-communists kind of, you know, being embedded in like kind of like the protests, the military gatherings that happen very frequently each year, and I think kind of the current narrative for a lot of folks in the second generation of Vietnamese Americans is that a lot of this anti-communist kind of ideology is going to die off once, you know, the old generation passes away. But I think that's a very simplified narrative, and I think it's very deeply rooted into kind of the community makeup. So I was wondering, in your field research or in your research within the community, what type of like programs or activities have you seen that have been kind of like an extension of that kind of like nation-building aspect, or trying to keep that ideology alive for second, third generation?
Right. First of all, I believe that the idea that the anti-communism of the first generation will eventually die off is a matter of assumptions based on immigration scholarship, especially towards ideas of assimilation and acculturation. And that itself has been largely debunked by you know, more recent scholarship. What I have seen, I think that anti-communism, as it will exist in Vietnamese America, will change. I do not think it will be an exact replication. I mean, it has never been an exact replication. It's always been a reutilization. And we can see possibilities of how that reutilization can shape out. But that in itself, I think is going to be up for the future. All I know is that anti-communism is probably going to remain. How it will look in the future will probably be ending up into how people choose to use it, how the second generation choose to use it. And you know, you can use it to, you know, sort of like reject refugees from entering this country, or you can use it to support, you know, democratic rights in Hong Kong. You know, these are reutilization of ideas, and I think in order to answer that question, we will have to wait and see. But then those are the possibilities. So yeah.
Next question.
I have a couple of comments. First, perhaps I would like to make a comment about Jason's presentation. First, all the presentations were great, but when you were talking about people eating flesh of the children,
yes.
it so much reminds, it's just, you know, like from a mold of the protocol of the elders of Zion. And it was published first in 1903 in Russia, but then it was translated and it was very popular in France too. I just was thinking how it is connected, may it be known or not.
Oh, that's a great question. I don't, simply, I don't know.
There should be some, because it's just almost word by word, the ideas that presented.
I would like to point something out. The date of this, I wish I could go into it more. The date of this, which was March of 1955, late March of 1955, it's, I think, and I have circumstantial evidence suggests it's very important, because at least a week before this rumor took off, a Polish ship, the Jan Kalinsky, arrived in Saigon with over 2,000 migrants, I believe. And according to the manifest, the original manifest said they were supposed to have, I think, somewhere in the realm of 2,152 migrants, but on the ship they had over 2,300 migrants, and the government, the authority in the South, held these migrants up for several days while they tried to figure out what was going on. Subsequently, it's believed that those extra 150 some odd people on board were themselves communists who had come south to infiltrate and to cause trouble. But simply put, I don't have a good answer. It's a good question, something to think about.
Thank you. And my question to Christophe, maybe a comment. I agree with you about the complexity of the names. I'm not sure I understand about the unity of the country, because Vietnam was not one country until 1802. The country was divided. Right, then there was a short colonial period, then it was a short period when there was one country, and then it was divided again. It's true that on both sides there was a discourse that we want to be one country, but it was very different in implementation, because the North wanted to make one country, but it was not just nationalist, because if it's nationalist, you get Americans out, you think that it would be enough, but they wanted to make it only under a socialist authority, and it was not negotiable, so it was export of revolution, right, to the South. And the South, for some time, and it was not really very prominent that they were making those stamps, that we will impose our flag over the North, but it was clear that they were not making any steps towards it. You showed very interesting maps of the fragmentation of the country, and they are very important. First of all, from the maps, we should admit that Zion was rather successful comparatively to what happened after him, right? Then you showed 1963, 1965, 1967. 1968, those maps change. And I worked with the documents that show how much the NLF were failing in recruiting new members. So if we look after 1967, especially after the Tet Offensive, it will be different. And what you said, that if we say South Vietnam and refer it only to the Republic of Vietnam. I agree with you that it might not be correct. Actually, in my book, I tried to work on both the Republic of Vietnam and the areas controlled by the NFL. So if you say that we delegitimize people who were not with the regime, I think it's fair. But then what about the people who did not want or who was not in agreement with the regime in the North? Why don't we talk about delegitimizing them? That's it.
So these are 4 topics. The first one is about a divided Vietnam and why it became such an article of faith among Vietnamese nationalists. I think that is the nature of nationalism, that it projects contemporary societies back into an imagined and idealized past. I think by the 1940s, I think there's a very broad consensus that Vietnam should overcome actually its divisions and become an independent, post-colonial, united territory. Unification, yes, these are eliminationist states. I think I borrow this term from Nguyen, exclusivist and eliminationist. One was more successful than the other, right? But I don't think it makes any sense to deny these ambitions, at least for the other side. The maps, yes, in my paper I do address this. I could not find, unfortunately, those CIA maps, very detailed ones, end in 1967. I addressed that clearly territorial control for revolutionary forces was much diminished after 1968. The CIA study itself claims that by 1972, in the wake of the Easter Offensive, that much of that territory lost had been reclaimed, as the NLF had been rebuilt probably by 1971, 72. Your fourth point was delegitimizing those who did not want to come under communist regime. Well, this is exactly what I'm not talking about, right? And I apologize if I didn't make that clear enough. I'm not interested in delegitimizing or legitimizing others. What I'm interested in is to create the space for the various factions of Vietnamese to be respectfully and fairly represented, and represented, therefore, also in adequate terminology, not invented terminology, and also in adequate mapping. So the question of legitimacy is, I think, irrelevant here. I'm extremely excited about the new departures in Republican studies, the focus on lived experiences in the Republic, in the urban spaces, the cultural approaches, the comparative freedom of thought and assembly. These are all valuable subject matters, but the equally valuable are those voices who were in opposition, because ultimately we do want to understand why 1975 happened.
Okay, I think we have maybe just for one short question, and we finish. But if you okay, please. Yes, please. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't see Alex there.
Me, I have something on your statement. You based on the primary source of Phan Vô Kỵ in 1957. At that time, I was there in Saigon, and I was 80 years old at that time. I followed my sister, who was a student, and she bring me up, go to the Thư viện Quốc gia, and met with her fellow student, both Southerner and the Northerner. And what I did there, she borrowed from me a book from Trương Minh Ký, story, con dế, con cò, con nhện, con ca hát. And yes, it's my entertainment for me and the study place for them. And for the eating flesh, my family flee from the north, and we live in a neighborhood full of the southerner. But we play together very good. And my sister, husband, my first sister, is the northerner. But my second sister husband is a southerner. And my first boyfriend is a southerner.
Thank you. Any comment? You have 30 seconds, Cindy, about all that stuff. That's all right. That's okay. Please, we need to make room for the next group to come. So please, if you have questions come up, I'm sure the panelists will be happy to answer. Thank you. Join me in thanking them for this wonderful panel.